Deadly medieval jobs. Like a low IQ fella who just ravaged a Viagra bottle, alchemy was simple, yet very hard. Simple in the fact that it had three main goals: turn metal into gold, discover a universal cure for all diseases, and achieve immortality. Simple on paper, but very hard in the reality that no one knew what they were doing. The vast majority of natural science at the time was still a mystery, and it was up to these alchemists to fill in the blanks. But on the path to reaching those improbable goals, many critical discoveries were made. Distillation allowed you to purify poopy brown water by boiling it and cooling the vapor to make less poopy brown water. Many plants could be mashed into festering wounds to make them feel less like you're about to die. And sprinkling some sulfur and charcoal over your non-suspicious pile of potassium nitrate could create something called black powder that may or may not be useful in some sort of gun-like device in the future. But every new discovery was the result of thousands of failures. Sure, alchemy would eventually shed away a lot of the primitive theoretical slag and refine itself into modern-day chemistry, but it took millennia of trial and error, and many died in the pursuit of eternal health and infinite wealth. The extent of the alchemical process boiled down to purification, isolating crude elements into their purest forms. And how do you purify things? Fire. Just heat stuff up until something happens. And that was the main problem. You see, alchemists had a rudimentary approach to their own safety when it came to faffing about with toxic substances. Their main form of protection was wearing long robes, or at the bare minimum, a durable leather apron. This would, at the very least, give +5 defense against any spontaneous splishes and splashes of any would-be lotions and potions. But if you've ever been chewed out by your chemistry professor, you know that's often the least of your worries. Now, getting a drop of salty water in your eye at school may seem trivial, but if that harmless sodium chloride enriched dihydrogen monoxide were instead something more spicy like, say, boiling hot mercury, and then things get a little bit more life-threatening-y. Alchemists didn't really use face or eye protection outside of just squinting a little bit and hoping for the best. But when that plugged beaker of boiling broth decides it wants to overcome a pressure differential, you're gonna wish that something was there between you and it. Now, if you were careful enough to uncork your cooking concoctions, you still had to deal with its byproducts. One of the most mysterious and thus often studied materials was liquid mercury. Since it looked like a metal yet flowed like a liquid, the element was often mistaken for the highly sought-after elixir of life itself, bringing many to an untimely end. But that didn't stop alchemists from trying to unlock its potential secrets. In any case, the last place that you would want to be burning toxic metals is somewhere cramped and poorly ventilated. Well, it's a good thing that many of the alchemical labs in medieval times were cramped and poorly ventilated, filled with lots of flammable books and papers to boot. So when putting toxic elements to the flame, like mercury or arsenic, you're gonna form some nasty fumes. Historical texts allude to these dangers, stating that the vapors, quote, injured the spirit and body. Trying to unlock the phenomenal cosmic powers in your itty-bitty living space is gonna mean trading breathable air for some that is deadly. The high concentration will almost certainly make your temporary life even more temporary. Your last feelings as you migrate to regions beyond will be that of you coughing up your burning lungs while your pounding brain feels like it's gonna burst out of your skull. Fun stuff. But even if you managed to dodge death in the short term, he was going to win the long game. Memory loss, hallucinations, or even paralysis are all possible side effects from long-term mercury and arsenic exposure. Sometimes, though, the most dangerous beast is ourselves. Unless directly employed by a higher power, alchemists often practice their craft in secret, not only to protect any possible discoveries, but to avoid accusations. Many of the more feeble-minded people at the time mistook the scientific aspects of alchemy for witchcraft and sorcery with all that conjuring of flames and whatnot. So if the explosions, fires, or fumes didn't get you, Ned the nosy neighbor might. You can already see how this one's gonna go. Listen, royalty has always been a world of extravagance and bragging rights. Get conquered, and you can bet that all of your treats and treasures were on full display to boast to other royals.
Look how big my shiny rod is.
Aye, take a gander at me family jewels.
Very nice.
But not all wealth was silver and gold, as King Henry III of England would soon come to realize in 1235. Arriving on the front doorstep one morning was a gift. 3 gifts, actually. As a present in good faith to maintain political relationships, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire dumped 3 adult lions on Henry's doorstep. King Henry absolutely adored the giant cats and set them up in a less than suitable habitat within the Tower of London, opening up the royal menagerie to royal guests as a royal flex. The menagerie eventually expanded, with elephants, a polar bear, non-polar bears, and several monkeys all taking residence within the walls. Now, each and every one of these exotic animals required special care, so in order to provide said care, specially trained animal experts were hired to do the job, right? No. It was, of course, cheap, uneducated, and expendable laborers that were the prime candidates. Poor, unfortunate souls sent to clean, feed, and care for the beasts. And it was all easier said than done. No matter how friend-shaped wild animals may seem, they're still wild animals, and they will murder you at a moment's notice. Once you stepped into the literal lion's den, you were at their mercy. Without extensive knowledge on how to meet their most basic needs, these animals were often feral and malnourished, and thus a very real threat, especially when you're looking like a tasty treat. Habitats at the time, if you could even really call them that, were often poorly constructed and weren't any more complex than a simple cage. Some historical records allude to incidents of collapsing cages or animals managing to break free from their chains and ripping apart caretakers limb from limb. It wasn't uncommon to catch a claw from time to time, or witness your buddy get converted into a PNG under an elephant's tree trunk of a foot. If you did manage to survive the animals unscathed, you might not survive your employer. Like I said before, the animals were royal property, so failing to keep them healthy may as well be a slap in the face of the king himself. Any keepers responsible for a premature death of an animal were in for severe punishment. The lucky ones were simply fired. The less than lucky ones were also fired. The profession of plague rat catcher is pretty self-explanatory. Bunch of plague-infested rats carrying plague-infested fleas running amok needed to be dealt with. Humanely, of course. Although rat catching or vermin extermination itself has been a profession for as long as rats have been around, they were especially in high demand during the time of the Black Plague. European cities like Paris or London were chock full of the little beasts. The spreading of the disease wasn't exactly well understood at the time, and instead of placing the blame on microscopic corn dogs, the usual go-to scapegoats were the devil, poisonous air, or the classic Jews. But some pattern-recognizing fellows realized that filthy rats usually carry filthy diseases. And it was true. Black rats, as they're known, very much did carry debilitating diseases. You got your leptospirosis to ruin your day, muscles always aching, fever never breaking, your liver dies, stinging red eyes, and a rash that never goes away. You also had samonella, which causes you to frequently force out fluids from front to back, but also makes you solid in your daily crosswords. When you don't want a mass infestation to evolve into a mass infection, rat catchers were hired to help minimize the spread as best they could. Rat catchers would hunt, trap, and kill the vermin, but in doing so, they put themselves at severe risk. The thing is, rats don't exactly like being caught, so they're gonna go into a full-fledged survival panic, gnashing and gnawing at anything nearby, which would most likely be fingers, hands, an arm, or a face. The obvious problem with that is the contraction of the aforementioned diseases as well as the Black Plague itself. Of course, there were many other hazards. Remember them fleas I mentioned? Well, they would do a little emigration to a new host. You. Once you were infected, all of your own personal fleas and lice, since you're a dirt poor medieval peasant, would then further spread diseases like wildfire. But bites and bugs weren't the only threat. Rat catchers often had to venture into enemy territory, squeezing through holes and swimming through cesspits to find rat nests to kill them at the source. Rummaging around in all of that danky and stanky meant a lot of environmental exposure. Sustaining a simple scrape against a stone slab that's subsequently slathered in shit leads to a nasty, potentially life-threatening infection. Similar to the gong farmers or night soilmen from my previous worst jobs video, these rat catchers could also succumb to suffocating in sewer slop. Not only that, but the frequent use of arsenic-based rat poison could do a number on the lungs. The good news, though, is that all of the success of the medieval rat catchers helped severely limit the spread of the Black Plague, bringing the total death count to only tens of millions of people. You did your best, rat catchers, and it makes for a nice tale. Now, if you think that grave robbing wasn't a job, think again. Although highly illegal, grave robbers still performed work with the goal of getting paid based on whatever they could yoink from defenseless corpses. Compensation for work sounds like a job to me. And it was way more common than you'd think. According to archaeological studies by the University of Cambridge, it's estimated that over 20% of graves in northern and western medieval Europe showed evidence of tampering between the 5th and 6th centuries. Graves were robbed for two main reasons. The first, and most obvious, was stealing valuables. This could be anything from grandma's bracelets, rings, or even her iconic red jewel. If you were brave, you could even rip out Gam Gam's golden teeth. The other reason was stealing the bodies themselves. Much more difficult, but potentially more lucrative. In the late medieval period, a medical revolution was underway, meaning that practicing physicians were in need of cadavers to poke and prod to figure out how humans worked. The fresh ones were preferred, but beggars couldn't be choosers. But they could be grave robbers. The dangers of the infamous side hustle were plentiful. For one, just digging 6 feet into the earth is not easy. If you've ever woken up to a few tons of gravel dumped into your driveway with your dad enthusiastically standing there with a shovel, you have an idea of how much it would suck. But besides the ergonomic injuries, digging that deep in fresh soil was very dangerous. By definition, loose soil isn't very stable, and there have been multiple reports throughout history of grave robbers being discovered buried in the very graves they attempted to rob. Robbers were also running the risk of digging up the diseased deceased. Victims of the plague, tuberculosis, leprosy, and smallpox can have their afflictions live on far after their own deaths. If life was like a box of chocolates, then death was simply a sack of farts. You knew exactly what you were getting, you just didn't know how bad. Cracking open a coffin could leave you coughing instead. But it was a known risk. If falling dirt and disease failed to cut your life short, then someone else would. Grave robbing was a crime, a very serious crime, and graveyards were holy property, and as such, any guards patrolling could act as your judge, jury, and executioner. Guards were granted special permission to deal with any disturbances any way they saw fit, like fitting a spear through your skull. Luckily, you've already done all the heavy lifting of digging a grave. The guards just had to tidy up. If the guards were more merciful, you would simply be arrested and your fate left to the courts. But you would most likely end up 6 feet over the ground before you ended up 6 feet under it. Bell ringers actually had a pretty important job for the everyday person. They were the timekeepers. Yeah, sure, there was that big glowing ball in the sky to tell you dawn and dusk, but all the other hours were approximations. It was up to bell ringers to mark the important times of the day, call people to service, or chime special occasions. But doing so was extremely physically taxing. A standard tower bell could weigh anywhere between a few hundred pounds all the way up to several tons. Granted, the big-ass bells required multiple people, but each man pulled his own weight, and then some. Having a tug-of-war match with a several-ton hunk of metal isn't the best wager to make. The sheer momentum of these bells as they swung back and forth was something to be reckoned with, and it demanded respect. Or else. A survey conducted in 1990 asked several thousand London bell ringers about any injuries sustained during their ringing duties, and the answers didn't leave much to the imagination. Ripped fingernails, crushed limbs, falls from the tower, and even accidental hangings had occurred. Ringing ropes became a death trap if the ringers became too complacent. Now keep in mind, this was in the 1990s, well into the modern age with considerations for safety. So imagine how much more frequent these types of injuries must have occurred back in medieval times. If you weren't snagged by the rope, you certainly had your bones rattled by the deafening sound of the bells themselves. Many of the large city towers were equipped with multiple bells, each one producing different pitches or rung under different circumstances. Being right in the middle of all that crippling cacophony meant the risk of blowing out your eardrums. Each separate ring could emit a head-splitting 120 decibels, well into the deafening range of sound, even if only momentarily. For comparison, 120 decibels is like being right next to T-Swift's private jet as it takes off to cross the street. Each of those bursts of sounds were enough to cause permanent damage to hearing unless protection was used. And you know damn well medieval bell ringers didn't use no protection. They simply took the method of, you'll get used to it. The biggest threat to a ringer's life, however, wasn't the bells or the ropes, but something a bit more flashy. Lightning. You see, back in the God-fearing, superstitious times of old, thunderstorms were believed to be moments of divine rage. But don't worry, when God's mad, you can just soothe him with the sweet clang of tuned metal. Or at least, that was the belief. Many medieval fellas instructed the poor ring-a-dingers to bang their bells in an attempt to chase away thunderstorms, and wouldn't you know it, didn't work. Some reports from the 1700s claim that over 100 bell ringers gained first-hand experience of the human body's ability to conduct electricity. Lightning could either strike the tower or the bell directly, delivering a death jolt down the rain-soaked line and through the poor soul attempting to single-handedly banish an entire fucking thunderstorm with a series of Taco Bell bongs. The number of deaths got so bad that some countries, like France, surrendered to the heavens and banned thunderstorm bell ringing until the invention of the lightning rod in the mid-1700s. Although it seemed like a relatively safe and simple job, working high in the tower had plenty of ways to get dinged in your dong. Alright, hear me out. The medieval scribe was by no means an adrenaline-charged, fast-paced profession, but that's kind of the point. The life of a medieval scribe was the most bland, boring, and mind-numbing jobs in all of human history. Before Papa Gutenberg invented his famous printing press, entire books were written by hand. This process was physically exhausting, mentally taxing, and extremely slow, resulting in books being expensive, which is why books were for rich people. But the requirement for a personal touch did allow for creative freedom, creating unique works of art with each copy. Sweet. But there's only so many times you can generate artistic flourishes around the word "the" before your creative juices start drying up. As a medieval scribe, your job was to write. All day, every day. Except Sundays. Those are for Jesus. But all of that writing, especially in the same position day in and day out, puts a very real toll on the human body. We simply weren't designed to sit for most hours of the day. So stop slouching. Scribes worked in specialized rooms called scriptoriums, which held all of the cutting-edge equipment needed for efficient scribbling: a writing desk, ink, paper, and feathers for quills. As for content, scribes copied a wide variety of topics: science, history, cultural literature, and of course, religious texts. This ensured that tradition and know-how could be passed down across the generations, binding knowledge in paper and leather. But them's a lot of words to read and write. Scanning hundreds of thousands of words with your eyeballs took a toll on them. The constant nearsighted strain often resulted in scribes fucking up their vision and developing chronic migraines. Now, there's often a misconception that, hell, even I had prior to researching this, that scribes were these frail old men writing by candlelight. That's not true. Instead, scriptoriums were specifically designed to take advantage of natural light, with windows facing the east to bathe in the morning sun. Writing desks were set up near these windows to maximize their illumination. The setting of the sun simply meant that your shift was over. Now, what people might not realize is that back in the day, candles were very expensive, and so was paper, so it would be stupid to literally burn through your money in a dimly lit room full of flammable paper. But yeah, like I said, all of that repetitive writing posed very real ergonomic hazards. The constant swishing of a quill across pages put a lot of wear and tear on joints and muscles, resulting in agonizing carpal tunnel syndrome and severe spinal deformations from all of the hunching over. But if osteoarthritis or chronic back pain weren't enough for you, other inherent dangers were waiting. Another health hazard for these scribbling scribes was the very medium used to immortalize history: the ink. Standard black ink was made from plant-based fluid and iron sulfate. Black was the most common color, thus it made up a vast majority of the writing, and luckily it wasn't too terribly toxic. But all of the fancier colors used to decorate or illuminate the pages certainly were. Vermilion red ink contained mercury, vibrant yellows and greens used arsenic, and bright white ink used lead. Exposure or absorption through the skin was known to have caused chronic physical or mental symptoms like rashes, headaches, and memory loss. Which brings up one of the more dangerous aspects of the job. It was actually very common for scribes to leave little notes in their copies alluding to them losing their friggin' minds. A note at the end of an 8th century book says, "He who does not know how to write does not think that it is a labor. 3 fingers write, the whole body labors. Whoever has read this book, pray for me." Another scribe from the 11th century wrote a little note at the end of his writing endeavor. It says, "Thus let this composition be ended here. God help my hands." And finally, we come to one of the most damning examples. It reads, "This shit sucks." This was a real problem. The constant mental anguish of doing nothing but writing for years caused some scribes to teeter on the edge of insanity, where a comfortable rope necklace could free them from their suffering. Metaphorically, of course. Scribes really were some of the most unsung heroes. Despite the mundane career path, they were a critical part of human history. They were the ones who preserved it, or at least their version of it. After all, writers had the right to write what they thought was right.